Good morning, men and women of Christ. Glad to be back with you with part 2 of this spirit-led teaching. Knowing the difference between a church salvation and a gospel salvation. A church salvation is where we made a profession of faith pertaining to the flesh. The gospel of salvation is where we're saved by faith in the Spirit. We go from a profession of faith, which was pre-cross, to salvation by faith, which comes through the cross. When we go from a profession of faith to salvation by faith, we're going from the mind of the flesh to the mind of the Spirit. We're going from the mind of the flesh to the mind of the Spirit, because you're now alive in spirit, and the flesh has to come under the eternal government of the fruit of the Spirit. So let us go to Galatians 5, 16 and 17. Galatians 5, 16 and 17. 16 says, "This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. These two are contrary one to the other." The flesh is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit is contrary to the flesh. These two are contrary the one to the other. The flesh being contrary to the Spirit, this is why the mind of the flesh and the flesh has to come under the eternal government of the Spirit, so that it can conform back. It can fall back in line with the Spirit, which is Christ, as opposed to in that fallen state, our spirit conform to the flesh and therefore be limited to the flesh. Well, through salvation, your flesh is brought back into its position to be in harmony with the Spirit. That's why it has to come under the government of the first fruits of the Spirit, which is Christ. Let us go to 1 Corinthians 8, 1, 2, and 3. 1 Corinthians 8, 1, 2, and 3. And it's discerning between the mind of the flesh and the mind of the Spirit. The difference between being puffed up and being built up. Romans 8, 1. It talks about touching things offered unto idols, but it quickly gets into the mind of the flesh and the mind of the Spirit. For we know that we all have knowledge, and we all have knowledge. But knowledge puffed up, that's the letter. But love edifies, it builds up, that's the light. It's making that distinction between the mind of the flesh and the mind of the Spirit. The mind of the flesh can get puffed up. It doesn't take much. The mind of the Spirit has to be built up. And as you're built up in Christ, in the mind of your spirit, he comes through that and subdues the flesh and brings it under the eternal government of the first fruits of the Spirit. And if any man, that's man or woman, think himself to know anything, he knows nothing as he yet ought to know it. When we're following the letter, when we have a biblical faith or a Judeo faith, we know nothing as we yet ought to know it. Because you're not in the light, you're in the letter, you're following the letter. So we don't know nothing yet as we ought to know it. But if a man or woman, that's three, love God, then the same is known of him. To love him, you have to be in Christ, and Christ generating that eternal quality of love through you unto him, because Christ has made all things unto us. We cannot love the Lord outside of anything but an eternal love. Well, we can't generate eternal love. That has to be manifested through us. That cannot be manifested by us. And Christ is our love towards God the Father as we abide in him. As we abide in him. So to make the distinction between the mind of the flesh and the mind of the spirit is crucial, because when you go from profession of faith in the flesh to salvation by faith in the spirit, you are going from the mind of the flesh to the mind of the spirit. To the mind of the spirit. Making that distinction between being built up and being puffed up is crucial, is extremely crucial. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of this teaching. I'll be back with you in part 3. Love you in Christ.